Her skin was almost black in the flickering light of the bathroom. In silence, she observed her own reflection, as if waiting for the mirror to say something that explains what had changed. There was a rumor behind her eyes, a damp hole where the names, the voices, the memories sank in. The cold tile leaning against his back was the only certainty, the only anchor not to let himself be swallowed. Outside, the hallway seemed to be swallowed by a constant gloom, as if the house was breathing slowly, waiting for some secret to escape through the cracks. She didn't know when her skin started to darken. In the beginning, they were furtive, stains which appeared in the folds, in the middle of the silence, as if the darkness hidden in the soul was leaking little by little into the flesh. It was painful to watch them grow, even more painful the suspicion that it wouldn't stop until it took everything. In the shower, she rubbed her arms until her skin screamed, as if she wanted to scrape out what was strange about her. The soap corroded, but the stains only deepened. In the room, a clock watched every second with the muffled ticking, mingling with the sound of his own heart. There were days when she avoided the windows, fearing that any beam of light would give the strange process away to the neighbors. The fear of the gaze of others ended up being darker than the shadow on the hands. When he looked in the mirror, he recognized his own face, but something pulsated there, a second layer, like snakeskin about to leave its old body. The phone rang twice. She didn't answer. The sound kept reverberating in her throat, a reminder that there was a world outside waiting for answers she didn't know how to give. He remembered the nights when he heard light footsteps in the hallway, an insistent noise of someone circling the house. Did the house know? Could the walls feel when the soul shattered with fear? In the bedroom, the sheets smelled of moisture, and she curled up, waiting for the sleep that never came in one piece. His head was heavy with unasked questions. What if it never stops? What if the transformation is just the beginning of something bigger, which will swallow everything she knows? The dark of the skin was also the darkness of the thoughts, a labyrinth where every wall danced before the eyes, impossible to escape. In the absence of light, she began to notice small differences. Her senses sharpened, her skin seemed to vibrate. At the slightest touch, almost as if jumping out of her body, he suspected that he could feel the emotions of others even before hearing them. This discovery was a double-edged sword. While it brought power, it only highlighted the gulf between herself and the others. The fear of not being understood grew along with the darkness of the skin. Sometimes a tear ran and drew a clear line through the black, as if the crying were a futile attempt to wash away the metamorphosis. She held back her tears, as if she were afraid that, if she gave in, she would dissolve, run down her own floor. One morning, between repeated dreams and whispers of someone who seemed to call her by the name she didn't dare say, she felt herself breaking. It was as if he left old pieces on the mattress, stripping himself of a body that was no longer his. The fear had not gone away. He had molded himself, denser, more intimate. Now, blended into the skin, it slipped along with each breath. The house remained standing. The mirrors never responded. But there alone, surrounded by the darkness that took on her color and her silence, she would realize, perhaps what transforms is not the skin, but what we never dare to touch within ourselves. Standing in the bathroom, with her almost black skin reflected in the fogged glass, she still waits, deep down, for a ray of light to cross the room and finally ignite the courage to be what no one sees, not even herself. There are small towns that seem forgotten by the rest of the world, where the presence of others is noted not by the noise, but by the very well-delimited silence. In northern Vermont, among thick woods and slopes that seem to grow every winter, lies the town of Lyndon, a place where old houses doze with peeling paint, streetlights flicker at too long intervals, and the night air always carries a fresh scent of pine trees mixed with a constant cold. Emily Carter had been living there for a short time, still carrying in her eyes those shadows left by a lifetime of frustrated attempts at belonging. She had left Chicago for the icy hills, convinced that isolation would be a balm for her recent wounds. The old brick house on the edge of the woods, acquired with his mother's inheritance, was spacious, plank floors lining corridors that were lost in darkened detours, doors creaking as if protesting the change. Emily walked across the doorstep. For the first time one October morning, air heavy with the smell of dead leaves and moss climbing the walls in the background. Only the promise of a new beginning named that gesture. As a child, she hoped that some trace of her own mother would register somewhere, a voice that didn't disappear entirely, a gesture lost among her belongings. But she found only boxes and boxes of papers, faded photographs, and the lingering echo of absence. Emily was a woman of 33, fair skin with freckles that she always tried to hide, blonde hair tied in a careless bun, watching the world for fear of unintentional exposure. He spent half his life trying to fit into the silent molds of others, collecting small rejections, a job in an office in Chicago where he always felt shadow, relationships too shallow, friendships that evaporated without farewell. The greatest fear was this: to dissolve into anonymity, to leave no mark, to become a pale static that no one sees, except when it was too late. When her mother died, she realized that there was no point in continuing in the big city. He quit, sold what he owned, put everything he could into an old pickup truck, and drove across states to Lyndon, figuring it would be possible to build something different there. Perhaps in that inherited house I could find some trace of belonging, a home planted among trees that did not know the corrosive haste of the big centers. At first, it was the silence that was most impressive. At night, lying on the old bed, in the attic, only the whisper of the wind hitting the shutters. The mornings were cold and damp, and Emily wandered around the house with silent steps, touching walls, trying to absorb some energy from the old inhabitants. There was a calm and constant sadness there, almost a confidence shared between the wood and the wind. The isolation was seductive. No one knocked on the door, no neighbor struck up a conversation. His few trips to the local market were quick, and the gaze of others never exceeded more than a brief greeting. She wanted to believe that she would finally have peace. But after a few weeks, the tranquility began to distort, as if something was tensing the air little by little, waiting for the right moment to announce itself. At first, there were minor discomforts. A blanket she knew she had left on the couch appeared folded the other way the next morning. The old clock in the dining room started to mark different hours than usual, delaying a few minutes every day, even after being reset. During the early hours of the morning, almost imperceptible noises, creaking wood where there was no draft, a slight ticking that seemed to come from the ceiling, even with the whole house quiet. Emily tried to rationalize. She convinced herself that she was just tired, too tense from the recent move, from the almost deafening loneliness. He carried the habit of turning on all the lights before going to sleep, checking doors and windows twice. But it only added to the impression of isolation, as if the house whispered behind every lighted lamp. It was on a particularly cold and dark night, when the fog covered the road like a damp sheet, that Emily noticed the first sign of something beyond what she expected. When he returned from the small market, he entered the house, bringing with him the smell of the cold and a package of groceries. The hall was plunged into a strange gloom, the watery light filtering through the sheets of the curtains. After a few steps, she felt a chill running down her spine. The door leading to the cellar in the basement was ajar. She remembered closing it when she left. The sound of something scratching, an almost inaudible breath coming from the depths. For a moment, the silence became viscous. Holding the bag tighter, he went to the door, trying to listen to the small details that escaped logic. A new smell hung in the air, like wet earth, but there would be a metallic touch there, something old, almost rotten. He went down one step, then another, but the scratch abruptly stopped. His heart was beating faster and faster, his hands sweaty. The phone's flashlight flickered as she rummaged through the boxes and the old rotten cabinet leaning against the back wall. But in that brief second of darkness, he had the impression of a small, almost amorphous figure moving through the shadows, like flesh sticking to the walls. Fear pointed to an unknown background, to a whisper that was almost a distorted prayer, coming from the pitch. Emily didn't want to believe it, but a part of her felt it. Something shared the space with her. Something lurking, patient, with the smell of secret and eyes that never blinked. Time slows down when the mind is invaded by discomfort. It became difficult for Emily to distinguish the beginnings of the small disturbances in the house. Like one drop dragging another into a bucket about to overflow. Each night brought a new sound, a new shadow that seemed out of place in that wooden environment. In the morning, the floor of the corridors bore faint marks, as if a wet paw had passed. Softly, the clock in the hall continued its strange march, now moving forward, now delaying, and no attempt at repair prevented that minimal but insistent disturbance of routine. At one point, Emily noticed that the closet doors creaked during the day, even without wind. A leaning window she was sure she had closed was open at dawn, letting a sweet chill in along with the smell of damp forest. Small things added together, but enough to take away your peace and install the weight of doubt in your chest. The feeling of loneliness has given way to that of invisible company, something that is not revealed but fills all spaces with an expectant presence. Stuffy footsteps at dawn, flashes of figures moving where they shouldn't. Everything seemed to cohabit with Emily like a second skin. On some mornings when she looked in the mirror, it was not only her own reflection that returned her gaze. There was the almost childlike impression of a pair of dark, veiled eyes, blinking on the other side, deep and attentive, waiting for something to happen. In an attempt to distract herself, Emily decided to explore the neighborhood. One day in November, with a sharp air, he led her to the local bakery, where the aroma of fresh bread tried unsuccessfully to warm the drawn-out conversations of the few customers. The town of Lyndon seemed permanent on his reservation. People greeted but avoided eyes, and Emily's questions about the old house were always met with short smiles and an uncomfortable exchange of glances. That's when she met Martin, the cashier of the place, a young man with a thin face and an almost whispered voice. When he heard the name of the street where she lived, he hesitated before handing over the change, advising with a subtle shake of his head to always keep doors very well locked at night. Words that reverberated, with no obvious explanation, as Emily wondered if the whole town shared a secret that only she was ignorant of. On the way out, he met a lady named Martha, with grey hair and a firm look, who watched Emily as if she already knew about her sleepless nights. The woman asked in a low tone if everything was okay in the house, if she had noticed different things. Emily, disconcerted, only smiled back, but the lady's gesture, a light touch on her own arm, as if pushing away a cold presence, was engraved in her mind. Sometimes the locals looked at her on the street with an almost tender insistence, almost as pity in disguise. Other times, in an anxious hurry to cross his path. The following days brought more discomfort. One morning, Emily would notice small footprints of earth coming from the garden and disappearing toward the basement. The plants that had been carefully placed near the door once woke upside down, as if a nervous creature had circulated there. The most disturbing sound, however, came in the deep silence of the early morning. Something like fingernails scraping the floor, stopping suddenly when she held the air to catch the movement. One night, she woke up startled by the sound of glass, a cracking on the other side of the house. When he reached the living room, he found only the window open, the curtains swaying, and a damp trail disappearing under the carpet, as if something had crept in and escaped through the shadows. Emily tried to search for information in the municipal library, an orange brick building surrounded by crooked oak trees. There he met Sarah, the librarian, a woman in her late 30s, with a restless look and a smile always half deconstructed. Sarah shook her hand, and upon learning of the house Emily had inherited, asked her if she had ever heard the stories of the woods. When Emily pressed it, the librarian just said evasively that some places are cutouts of different times, and not everything needs to be fully understood. There was talk of presences and old secrets, but the answers always evaded the details. Emily felt a chill down her spine at the sudden way the subject was put aside, a subtle invitation to resignation. Restlessness accompanied her even during the day. As I walked along the trails near the forest behind the house, the wind seemed to carry whispered voices, sometimes hoarse, sometimes high-pitched, and the constant sensation of falling under the gaze of invisible eyes. She felt watched. A weight was in the air, as if something was always about to cross the fine line between body and dread. The electronic devices showed strange behavior. The television turned on by itself on a channel where there was only static. The radio buzzed at dawn. Emily went to sleep with the bedroom door locked, a lamp on, unable to shake the thought that she coexisted with something there. One night, when he got up to drink water, he saw a shadow creeping along the bottom of the corridor, agile, low and grotesque, revealing for a moment long claws and a luminous eye in the pitch. The air became heavy, humid, as if the forest had invaded the limits of the house once and for all. The creature disappeared toward the basement, and Emily remained motionless, terrified by the certainty that the stranger had finally ceased to hide. But it was only the beginning. The mystery advanced under the skin, making it clear that not even in isolation could fear be locked away forever. The days in Lyndon dragged on through mists and ever thicker silences. Emily tried for some time to refuse the invitation of fear, but the succession of inexplicable events and the feeling of being watched were eroding her resistance. The nighttime noise of fingernails scratching the floor now seemed to come from within her. The whispers of the forest, already so familiar, seemed to have learned his name. The restlessness became permanent. One morning, while trying to shake off the suffocating feeling of the house, Emily decided to rummage through the abandoned rooms on the second floor. I was convinced that something, a key, a memory, a meaning, had to be found there. The closets were full of old junk, cookbooks, yellowed old posters, some broken porcelain dolls. But it was in one of the last drawers, hidden under letters with no sender, that she found a photo album of faded leather. The album belonged to his mother, but the front pages showed serious faces, dating back at least 80 years, all posing. Next to the same house, the woods visible in the background. Some had strange marks on the skin of their arms or faces, dark spots that drew like branches, shadows on the flesh. In the final pages, Emily's own mother appeared, as an adult, always with a tense expression. In one of the most recent photos, the woman was standing by the old well at the back of the house, head down, hands trembling. Emily felt her chest tighten. A fear mirrored in her own was visible on her mother's face, as if a secret was about to emerge from the depths of everything. Along with the album, inside an envelope, there was a letter written by someone named Vincent Carter, a hurried handwriting, ink stains on the sides. In the letter, Vincent recounted sleepless nights, sounds coming from the basement, and the impression of being followed by a ghost thing which scratched the walls like wild animals. He spoke of an ancestral curse linked to the land where the house was built, and claimed that that blood, theirs, had attracted the one who slept there. Emily read and reread, feeling the fear turn to nausea. The words seemed to echo everything. She also experienced as if history followed an unchanging ritual through the generations. He decided to search the library for answers, hoping that Sarah could shed some light on the surnames and disconnected sentences in the letter. The librarian hesitated before helping, but before Emily's distressed eyes, she scoured archives of old newspapers and school reports. Together, they discovered articles about families that disappeared without a trace, reports of strange practices in the vicinity, and above all, several mentions of the presence of a creature made of shadows and mottled skin that wandered among the trees at night. A yellowed article cited the existence of a hereditary mark among the families that occupied those lands, a dark seal that was fixed to the skin of the inhabitants and grew with each generation, like a passing disease. From mother to child, Emily realized with a heavy heart the connection. The same strange darkening that had been born on her skin had been coming from ancient times, a strange bond of blood and earth. Back home, the feeling of always being on the verge of a definitive revelation ended up drawing her to the basement. The flashlight trembled in his hand as he walked down the steps, staring at the thick smell and the fungus-laden humidity. He found, leaning against a darkened corner, a heavy wooden box. Inside were newspaper clippings, oddly shaped wax casts, and more letters, all describing terrified nights and gloomy manifestations. A pencil note written with force said, "She takes the form of someone who fears, scratches doors, dreams of our skin. We do not sleep in vain." Among the papers, Emily found a more recent diary, her mother's. The writing changed from calm to frenetic. The last page, however, was stained with ink and tears. "I tried to run away, but the shadow walks under my skin. Emily can't know. Now I understand. We have no choice. We are the house. We are the soil. We are the darkness." She had barely finished reading when an icy wind made her look up. From the darkest corner of the basement, the presence made itself felt. First, the yellow glow of a single eye, then the grotesque outline of a bent creature, skin marked with indistinct spots, long claws scratching the floor. The creature seemed to compose and dissolve the shadows around it, breathing along with Emily's fear. But as she stared at her, Emily felt a strange connection. It wasn't just threat, but recognition. The deep pain that had invaded her in recent months, the mutation in her own skin, all the anguish since her mother's death. Everything merged into an unsettling link with that being. She went back up to the main floor, stunned. Her skin stood on end and her mind was in turmoil. He continued to wander around the house, touching the wall, floor and windows, feeling that he had always belonged to that place, even when he did not know. The terror was not only external, it was the echo of the very essence. The curse, the darkness wasn't just in the house, it was in his lineage, in his body, growing every night, taking forms beyond the flesh. Emily wept, understanding at once. Her mother's past, the history of the stains, the creature's secret. She was part of the cycle, caught between fear, mystery, and the will to survive. There were too many questions in the air, but the main one was, how long until Emily herself became shadow flesh and desire for darkness? Night fell over Lyndon like a thick cloak, and the house was no longer a refuge for Emily. Fear, once contained in the cracks of the walls or among the noises of the floor, now seemed to pulsate at every corner. It breathed, moved, and expanded along with her own anxiety. Days and nights merged into an overwhelming confusion, and time lost its meaning. The clock insisted on telling hours that never advanced, and the sky always seemed dark, even when it tinged with grey in the window. Emily felt like a prisoner of a kind of mental fog, as if every thought was whispered from the outside in, a voice that wasn't hers, trying to convince her to give up, to give in to her dread. In the kitchen, glasses exploded for no reason, shrapnel piercing the air before disappearing onto the floor, as if they had never been real. The lights flashed once, twice, 20 times, until the pitch black consumed everything. Then silence. In the midst of this absolute silence, Emily began to hear her own name ringing in the dark, first softly, then carried by the wind, until it echoed against the doors, ringing in her ears like a threat. She tried to fight the urge to flee aimlessly through the halls of the house, but her feet acted on their own. One stormy morning, she woke up lying in the icy basement without remembering to have come downstairs. She felt her skin throb under. Layers of sweat, the dark spots burning with an internal burning, and she realized that the smell of the creature, dirt, rot, humidity, permeated her little by little. She stumbled up to her room, and in the mirror, the returned image was distorted. Her face, marked by shadows, and her eyes, black and sunken, were almost the face of the creature observed that night. Emily closed her eyes, but her vision didn't fade. Somehow she saw the world as if she were on the other side of the mirror, an intruder in her own body. He began to have more intense visions. She walked around the house and suddenly the rooms were transformed before her eyes. The room of the past, clear and old, with silent parties, human shadows occupying armchairs, all with marked skin looking at her without blinking. She felt the texture of the wood brushing against her skin, heard the voices of the dead, all whispering a secret impossible to understand. Sometimes she would wake up on the floor, her head throbbing, memories mixed, with daydreams, and she never knew for sure whether she had lived through it or daydreamed. The wet footprints returned, but now they formed around her own feet as she walked through the early hours, overwhelmed by impulses she couldn't control. Some nights the house seemed to try to drive her out. Doors slammed with deafening violence. The wood crackled as if it were going to break. Screaming voices echoed in the hallways, and she could only shrink under the covers, her eyes fixed on the ever-growing stain on the ceiling, feeling smaller and smaller in the face of the storm inside and outside. Other times, however, the house called to her. Whispers guided her to the basement, walls beating in step with her own heart. Every night, the entity got closer, going from hiding in the shadows to showing itself in flesh and claws, green eyes and sunken eyes that seemed to see everything about Emily. She faced not only the fear of what she saw, but of what she felt, blossoming within her, a growing, wild, strange impulse, as if the creature wanted to live through her, to dominate her will, to redefine her body. Doubt corroded his last ties with sanity. Sometimes she thought she had gone mad, that nothing there was real, that everything was a distorted reflection of the grief for her mother, of the isolation, of the loneliness that dragged her from Chicago. He began to question the touch of the floor, the texture of the furniture, the smells. She was sure of makeup or dirt under her fingernails, but she washed her hands until they bled and the stains wouldn't go away. When he visited Sarah in the library again, he felt the girl's look of pity and almost screamed in despair when he realized that he no longer knew if the words exchanged were said, thought, or whispered by another voice inside him. Paranoia made her distrust even her own body. Footsteps behind him might be echoes, but sometimes they were just spasms in his frayed mind. As the days passed, the mother's face appeared in each mirror, covering its own, murmuring messages born of the oldest fear. She felt the skin really transform. The spots moved, alive, darkening even her fingers, elongating their edges little by little, like roots trying to entwine from within. At the height of a drawn-out night, thunder lashing the world outside, Emily saw the creature appear at the foot of the bed for the first time. The walls pulsed in unison, all the lights died out for good, and the yellowish eye of the shadow shone like a knife's point in the dark. The entity came closer, its choppy breath blending with Emily's, and touched her arm with the tip of its claw. Emily felt the last idea of a barrier shatter within her. It was as if there was finally no difference between human flesh and scarred skin. He could hardly scream, but he felt the house tighten. Everything vibrated, from the windows to the floor. A wave of weakness ran through her muscles, and Emily thought it would all end there, in the dark bed where reality and nightmare come together. Now, in every gesture, doubt and movement, he knew that he no longer controlled his own story. It was observed, tested, transformed, at the mercy of something old, like the earth under the house. All that remained was fear, and the certainty that inside and outside of herself, the threat only grew. The cold of the house stuck to every inch of skin, making it impossible to separate what was fear from what was physical pain. Emily awoke and fell asleep between spasms, her body trembling as she struggled to distinguish dream from wakefulness. There was no more certainty in the world. The spot on his skin now seemed to pulsate of its own accord, spreading to the base of his neck, like a hungry root trying to take control of his heart. The creature was a constant presence, sometimes suffocating and dark silence behind the doors, sometimes liquid shadow that crawled under the beds or sneaked through the cracks in the ceiling. There were eyes, always eyes, shining in the corners. And in the reflections, her skin had become as strange and inhuman as the entity's skin. Screaming was no longer useful. Swallowed by fear, Emily felt her muscles retract in an instinctive gesture of protection, but it was impossible to hide from something that lived inside her. The memories of her mother came back like sudden storms, muffled arguments, tense looks, the feeling of being different as a child, the frustrated attempts to seek shelter. Emily realized that this ancient pain was the root of everything, and the entity seemed to know. It explored every bit of doubt and regret, distorting memories and feelings until Emily saw only herself as an enemy. Familiar voices echoed inside. The house, the disappointed mother, schoolmates who mocked her loneliness, the echo of rejection, and the murmurs of everyone who had ever left her behind. The sound repeated until Emily wanted to pluck out her own ears. The shadows created specific shapes, the shadowy and immense figure of the mother, past dialogues transmuted into accusations, laughter echoing from the closets. It was a psychological siege as powerful as the physical, and Emily knew that the real challenge was to survive the internal breakdown, to keep her mind intact when everything in her seemed to want to crumble. Every night was a climb. The atmosphere inside the house became oppressive to the point that she felt swallowed up by the darkness. In an attempt to react, Emily risked movements designed between terror and impetus, perhaps reviving the courage of her ancestors in the accounts and diaries she had read so much. He desperately searched for something with which he could hurt the creature, rummaging through drawers for old rusty knives, broken candles, anything that could serve as a shield or weapon. The house seemed to close at every attempt. Doors locked by themselves, objects disappeared from the hands without logical explanation. When he finally escaped from the room, he crossed corridors where the walls pulsated, oozing a black sap that stained his path. Each step was a crossing between worlds, the real and the hallucinated. Emily felt the nails grow on her right hand, claws thin like those of the entity. The terror of becoming that almost made her give up even before the confrontation. At the bottom of the basement where it all began, Emily faced the creature face to face for the first time since the night it all fell apart. The entity was larger than in the visions, compressing the surrounding air, filling her insides with panic. Claws outstretched, an animal murmur dangling from its black lips. The creature moved in sync with Emily's fearful beat. But at that moment, something broke in the cycle of submission. Emily rose beyond terror. The image of her mother darkened. By the marks was replaced by the real memory. That mother who fought day after day to protect her daughter, trying the impossible so that the darkness would not claim her. Emily understood then that to survive was not to deny who she was, but to take on the legacy and shape it in her own way. She took a deep breath, forcing herself back to the present moment, taking control of the marked body. The cold tried to pull her back into paralysis, but she moved forward, feet firmly on the damp waste of the floor, the knife trembling in her hands. As the creature advanced, Emily noticed her own thoughts becoming clearer, overriding the entity's commands. Every external whisper was now answered by a memory of resistance, running in childhood, jumping over the school wall, embracing solitude. With each approach, she felt her own skin burn, not in pain, but in willpower. When the entity grabbed her by the shoulders, Emily screamed at the top of her lungs, not a cry of panic, but of defiance. The creature hesitated, and at that moment, the shadows shuddered. As he physically struggled to extricate himself, the internal struggle was even more brutal. Voices mocked, accused, and pleaded in her mind, but Emily forced the thought to the surface. I'm not just darkness. I'm not just fear. With a desperate blow, Emily plunged the knife into one of the entity's arms. There was a roar, and she felt the plague of spots tremble under her skin, as if all the force of that evil tried to drip away from her. The entity staggered, dissolving for a moment into chaotic shadows. Emily took advantage of the moment to run out of the basement, each step overcome, not only with her body, but by the weight of the traumas overcome. The whole house shook, as if that internal resistance released a crack in the structures of the place and the curse. Emily shuffled across the room, feeling the heavy air slowly clear. She still didn't know if she could escape unscathed, or even if the marks would disappear someday. Probably not. But she understood now that her survival depended on not giving in to fear, on choosing herself even in the face of everything that pulled her into the darkness. The conflict was not won, but for the first time since Chicago, Emily felt a beginning of hope, a possible spark of light in the skin scarred by the night. The storm seemed to engulf Lyndon, the winds whipping the house as if trying to snatch it from its place. The windows vibrated, the lightning streaked the sky, and within that apocalyptic scenario, Emily felt about to cross an absolute boundary between the world of the living and the indecipherable universe of shadows. The house, which was once a refuge and then a prison, was now the scene of the final clash between the marked heiress and the ancient entity that haunted her. In the dense silence after another clapper, Emily heard the call, a low, guttural sound that reverberated through every board, every pipe, every corner of her soul. He knew that there was no way to escape or pretend anymore. In front of the mirror in the hallway, she saw herself without reservation. Black spots rising up her neck, veins pulsing under her skin, strangely almond-shaped eyes reflecting the creature that sought rest and dominion in her. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, not as an accusation, but as a consolation, and Emily felt a rare, unlikely comfort, the memory of the childhood embrace, the protective gesture, mixed with primal fear. The entity, now fully materialized, took on an even more terrifying form. A gigantic, ethereal physical presence with gleaming claws and empty eyes. The smell of wet earth and rotting flesh filled the air, suffocating. Emily retreated by instinct, but she remembered every step she had taken so far, the desperate escape through the basement, the resistance forged by force between pain and the will to survive. She felt a strange hatred grow, not for the creature itself, but for the feeling of powerlessness that she had cultivated in her since childhood, as if all trauma, all rejection, all loneliness had been food for that being. The house collaborated. With the terror, doors slammed by themselves, stairs creaked under invisible feet, whispers ran through the ceiling, but Emily already knew how to distinguish the real from the manipulated. He recognized for the first time that his struggle was not only against something external, but against the desire to hide, to accept his own insignificance and give up. In the central hall, under the old chandelier, the entity advanced. Claws, ready, mouth opening in an impossible animal scream. Emily felt time slow down, her body tremble, her mind one step away from collapse. It was at this extreme moment that a brutal decision arose before her. Fight with the rusty knife, or face the creature on her own terms, accepting that perhaps transformation was her destiny, but not her doom. In the split second that the entity jumped, Emily dropped the knife and opened her arms, not by defeat, but in the purest conscious surrender to his legacy. He stared into the eyes of the monster without trembling. He saw in them echoes of all the suffering stored in that land, voices of dozens of ancestors who had succumbed in the worst way, fighting against the inevitable instead of transforming it. The monster's eyes dilated in confusion. Emily felt a prodigious force rise from the ground, through her body, a dark and ancestral energy, burning but also pulsating with a new and violent life. It was fear, but also courage. It was destruction, but also possibility. She took a step forward, holding the creature's gaze, who hesitated and retreated, the sensation of the stain growing, her claws retracting under her skin, her heart beating in a wild rhythm. Everything became part of the same body, hers, her mother's, her grandmother's, all who came before, all those who fought and fell there. Emily spoke, but it was as if her voice came from all corners. "You don't dominate me. I'm part of it, and that's part of me." In the deathly silence that followed, she felt the will of the entity trying to crush her once more, stirring memories of abandonment, of her mother's cold gaze, of childhood insults, of absolute loneliness. Emily trembled from head to toe, aware that any faltering could make her crumble forever. But she held firm to the almost forgotten memory of a mother turning on lights in the darkness of her room, saying, "Don't be afraid, I'm here." It was then that the creature dissolved into dozens of shadows, voices, echoes, trying to possess it, trying to drag it into the dark background of itself. Emily felt herself being torn between what was, what she feared she would be, and what she could yet become. Each moment was a decision: give in to terror or embrace what was monstrous and human in itself. He forced his thought into everything he loved: the smell of his mother's books, the soft light of quiet afternoons, the chill on his face as he walked through the empty city, the hope of not repeating stories of suffering. Gradually, she noticed the intensity of the shadows weakening and the spots on her skin burning, as if burning to be reborn. When everything seemed to fall apart, Emily fell to her knees on the cold floor of the vestibule, and for what seemed like an eternity, there was nothing left. Then, in the midst of the feeling of the end, came absolute silence, not the menacing silence of before, but an emptiness full of possibilities. The entity had become just a latent presence, mixed with the veins, with no control over the body, but still part of its essence. In the reflection of the broken glass of the door, Emily was no longer the haunted woman, nor the creature, but a strange intersection between strength and scar. When she got up, she understood the extent of the sacrifice. She would never be completely free, but she would also no longer be a prisoner. The choice to accept, transform, and coexist with the darkness became his ultimate weapon against that cycle of generations. Outside, the wind had calmed down. Emily took a deep breath, exhausted, and let herself be moved by an unexpected relief. He had lost part of himself, but he had gained a strength that no longer depended on fear. The house seemed lighter, the air less heavy, and the echoes of the past finally faded. The transformation was harsh, but in that moment, Emily knew that survival was possible, even if it meant walking forever in the shadows inside and outside her skin. The next day arrived with a grey light that crept through the worn curtains, softer but never quite comfortable. Emily awoke with her body crushed, every muscle aching as if she had been through an old war. For long minutes he remained motionless, feeling the weight of the previous dawn compressing his chest. She stood up slowly, trembling. The cold floor of the house now quieter than ever, but it wasn't the same silence that had made her feel like a prisoner. It was a silence of uncertain calm, as if a very ancient predator had simply retreated into the shadows of its own memories. In front of the mirror in the hallway, she looked carefully at her own image. The black spots were still there, now outlining her neck and spreading to her forearms, but the skin around her seemed more alive. Her eyes, once so strange, shone with another kind of intensity, a mixture of exhaustion and newfound vitality. Emily touched her face, letting her fingers slide over the dark scars. It was not possible to erase the signs of what had happened, and, unexpectedly, she no longer wanted to tear that part of herself. They were tests of survival, not defeat. He sat down at the table, where the sun hesitated to enter fully, and realized that he was hungry for the first time in days. He prepared a hurried coffee, hands still trembling, feeling a strange satisfaction when he heard the domestic noise breaking the oppression of the night. The familiar smell of the drink, mixed with the subtle aroma of cold and old wood, composing a scenario that almost resembled an ordinary house. Emily knew with painful clarity that she could never go back to who she was. But she would also no longer be a puppet of ancestral fear, a partial liberation, full of doubts, but real. Time seemed to run more slowly there, between the daylight and the marks of the night. Emily found the strength to tidy up the shards scattered around the room, pieces of glass, shards from the chandelier, clothes torn off during the fight. Each action required concentration, but it also functioned as a ritual of reappropriation of that place. Ordinary things took on new weight. The sound of footsteps on the floor, the creaking of the stairs, even the faint rustle of the wind through the cracks. Nothing else was totally innocent, but neither was it just a threat. Everything now carried an unsettling duality. For the first time, he opened the curtains of the upper floor, facing the forest, which remained rooted in silence outside. Lyndon was dawning, the square still deserted, but signs of life were emerging. Neighbors crossing the street, the first cars on the road, a child playing with his dog. Emily watched, torn between the desire to experience that normalcy and the awareness of being forever different. Still, he allowed himself a short smile when he saw Martha bringing fresh bread next door. He recognized there, in the daily life of the city, a tenuous hope, if not of belonging, of contact with the world beyond the walls and stains. The courage to go out on the street did not come immediately. Hours passed before she felt ready to face the light and the gaze of others. He dressed, carefully covering the marks, and took a deep breath as he crossed the door. The cold air bit his face. The smell of wet earth and old leaves was almost comforting. She crossed the garden, imagining the steps of her mother, and so many other women who lived there and felt part of a lineage rewritten with great difficulty. At the market, he noticed that some were averting their eyes, perhaps aware of what the Carter house was carrying. Others, like Martin in the bakery, just smiled, and Sarah, the librarian, touched his hand in silence, a gesture of rare empathy. It wasn't complete acceptance, but it wasn't pure fear either. Emily realized that from then on, life would be made up of brief appearances of courage between great intervals of uncertainty. He imagined himself trying to rebuild ties, even though he could never reveal the whole truth, and he understood that to survive was to continue even without guarantees. On returning home, late in the evening, Emily collected old letters forgotten under the door. Most of them were invitations for donations, but among them there was an envelope without a sender. The paper gave off a smell of dust and moisture, and inside was only a folded, handwritten sheet. The lyrics were unknown. To those who see the stains, not all darkness is erased. The roots are deep. Be careful not to forget. The phrase made her heart race, a twinge of warning, cutting through the thin veil of security she was beginning to build. Inside, the house seemed small again. For a moment, Emily had the distinct impression of hearing footsteps coming from the basement, too light to ignore, familiar enough to rekindle old fears. He approached the stairs, but the sound disappeared, swallowed by the tense silence. The cold returned, but now it coexisted with an austere heat, as if the shadows in her had found only temporary rest. As he lay down, he struggled with insomnia for the last time that night, watching the spots glow faintly in the light of the lamp. The dormant entity in his blood seemed quiet, but not subdued. Emily then understood that the cycle was not ending. The old pattern had been broken, but the darkness would never be completely absent, nor would the answers be definitive. She would be sentinel of the threshold, someone who watches the boundary between light and shadow, between monster and human. Before falling asleep, he heard in the distance the same subtle call, like the echo of a whisper beyond the forest, a warning that peace was transitory. Emily closed her eyes, hugging sleep with a tight but determined chest, certain that the fight would always start again, and that she was now prepared to face the next chapter of the Carter House mystery. If you liked this story full of suspense and mystery, leave the like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss any new episode. Here, you're part of a community that loves to immerse yourself in unsettling narratives, chat about theories, and unravel secrets together. So come with us, comment below what you think, and call your friends to be part of this adventure. Don't miss out, huh? The next darkness may be closer than you think.